Hi there. Obviously, Tuesday is a big day politically for the Chinese government. It's opening ceremony of the NPC plenary session. For the first time in 30 years, the world's second largest economy will drop to a historical low of 6%, according to the work report delivered by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang Tuesday morning in Beijing. The underperformance of the Chinese economy has been compounded somehow by both the supply-side structural reform domestically and the trade tensions with the United States. To discuss these issues more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Dr. Hong Zhen, founder and chairman of the Hainan Group, and David Mahong, executive chairman of the Mahong China Investment Management. We shall also speak via satellite to Robert Gabb, director of the Economist Corporate Network in Hong Kong. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our dialogue here, gentlemen. I wonder if you have followed very closely the work report that Premier Li delivered Tuesday morning. What are the points that have impressed you most concerning the economic performance of China?
I think the Premier gave a very detailed and organized delivery of what the government have achieved in the last year in a very structural way, including achieving the GDP of 6.6% in 2018. Also the unemployment rate, and also the reduction of the poverty elevation. There are many others. I think also the government is putting taxes on certain of the things, tax reductions for SMEs, for companies in the future. So I think a lot of discussions on Tuesday's presentation was a lot of pretty encouraging.
Forecast of the Chinese economy has been booming somehow. If you look at comments on the social media and overseas coverage on the downward economic spiral. But Premier Li Keqiang was cheered on by many warm applauses throughout the process of the delivery. Does that somehow reflect the expectations of the general public about the sustainability of the Chinese economy? What do you think of the resilience? What are the driving forces, if any?
Well, the driving forces are that there is still strong consumption in China. Urbanization continues to be a major force. And frankly, China will get probably in excess of 6% GDP growth this year. But even at just over 6%, it's a lot better than when it grew at in excess of 9% 5, 6, 7 years ago. In those years, China would gain another 2 trillion to its economy. But with growth just over 6%, China could gain 5, 6, even 7 trillion. It is a much more sophisticated economy with a much higher base. So today's GDP growth has been compared to the 90s, which is a great misleading statistic. This is a much more developed and sophisticated economy now. China could even go below 6 and still be in a healthy state economically.
Earlier, I interviewed Martin Wolf, chief economics commentator of the Financial Times, who had made predictions on how China's economy would play out. Let's see what he has to say.
The biggest challenges are in fact domestic, not external. That is to say, the trade threat is a manageable one. It will be costly, but it's manageable. China is not the China of 10 or 15 years ago. It's less trade dependent than it was. And it's less dependent on foreign technology than it was. It has a greater capacity for domestically driven growth than it had. There's the potential to create now a huge mass consumer market, the biggest in the world, which will drive growth, I think, for decades. I think trade will fall as a share of GDP naturally. It's still very high for such a big country. So trade will become less important. That doesn't mean it's unimportant. And similarly with investment. So the key things are the development, the key challenges are the domestic developments. And many of the challenges you indicated are also opportunities. Think about the environment, that China has immense potential for investment in productive new technologies in the environmental sector. It becomes the world leader in green technologies. Indeed, I expect that to happen. It has tremendous potential to use technology to solve many of its social and economic problems. It has tremendous potential to improve social infrastructure and social consumption in areas like health and even in areas like education. It's still a developing country, and that means that there is obviously enormous domestic potential. Unleashing the domestic entrepreneurial and technological potential of China ought to give it another generation of pretty rapid growth. And so those obstacles, the domestic obstacles, can be met. Dealing with the debt in that context is really, I think, to dealing with the structure of demand in China and the distribution of income. I've argued many times, if you can shift more income to households, there will be higher consumption, less need for debt-driven investment. But I believe that the right focus for China, not to forget the world matters and China will be a leader in it. But the crucial thing is to take advantage of the domestic opportunities, which are also domestic challenges. The potential is there. And I don't really think, short of some catastrophe, that the world can stop it.
That was the interview that I did last March with Martin Wolf. But David, Martin said China is no longer what it was 10 or 20 years ago. In what way do you think China is very different? And does that deliver a positive or somehow cautious message about our economic performance?
I think what Martin would be alluding to is that China is now a much more urbanized country. The middle class is huge. I mean, it's the same size as the American population. And his comments on trade. China was never utterly trade dependent, but it was relatively trade dependent through the 90s. That's changed. So it's correct that it is no longer a critical aspect of whether the Chinese domestic economy will continue to grow and Commonwealth will spread. So the other thing is that China has reformed so much in 20 years. Its banking system, its SOE system. You have an anti-corruption campaign that's now been running for almost 10 years, which is a very powerful message to clean up the way that people do business, the kind of obligations they have to city officials, and even looking at the deleveraging of the banks, which has slowed the economy very much in the last 18 months. That's removing the imbalances of debt from balance sheets of banks. So all this has been immensely positive, and it's quite hard-nosed. To say this is not an economic reforming government is a sort of Western fantasy of some sort. You know, somehow China will lose the plot and it will no longer engage in economic reform. These are deep and very, very dramatic economic reforms. So it is a very different country. It's also exposed to the world. The world now can see China more clearly. Yes, it's not trade dependent, but we're now more interdependent on China as foreign countries, as China is with its trading partners and those it sources raw materials from. So it's a very different landscape. But it's one in which China is larger, China is stronger, but unfortunately China has been cast as a threat, particularly in some parts of our region, which is a great pity because China is not a threat. It is still a country tending very much to its own needs.
Thank you so much. Let me cross over to Michele Garacci, an Italian economist who's standing by in Italy, and he's going to talk to us on the phone. Hello. Briefly, Michele, President Xi Jinping listed 3 major issues as the top concerns on his agenda. For example, the prevention of systematic financial risks, poverty alleviation, and pollution reduction. Do you think these 3 goals are easier to accomplish given the adversity of the external risks and the trade talk, I mean, as well as the downward economic spiral? So a lot of challenges are lying ahead. But what do you think of the feasibility of getting the job done with the powerful political will of the presidency of Mr. Xi Jinping?
Good afternoon, Jan Ray. I believe those 3 goals are both achievable and needed because the poverty reduction goal is a social goal that at the same time also tries to bring average income of the low end of the population at a reasonable level. So that is an additional contribution to potential consumption. The second one on green is also very important, and it is also very important specifically in an environment where economic growth may not be as high as we have seen for the last 40 years. So we're looking at 6.5%, And it is important that the narrative in China changes to the goal of the government is not just to increase wealth of the average citizen, which is important, and it is still there, but in addition to that, there is also the other goal, to get a more livable environment. And I have to say, the results, surprisingly maybe for those who have always had the negative views, are coming to be seen. You guys live in Beijing, and probably you are the first one that start to see the benefits of a greener economy, not just the pollution of the air, but also the second leg, which is the push for electric green economy. And so we are looking at revamping of the transport system. So I think these are very important goals, achievable, and also supportive to sustain the growth for the next few decades. Your previous guests were talking about next 10, 20 years of growth. I would also add the third component, which is the migration flow from rural to urban areas, which still goes at about 1% per year of in percentage of population. And that is between 1 and 1.5% of GDP growth contribution, just coming from an increase in the input factor. The moment that the farmer moves to the city, it trebles his income. And so that is also the third engine. And I'm positive that the growth will continue at those levels. 6.5% of a higher and higher base, it still means a higher and higher absolute growth in dollar terms.
Thank you so much. That's Michele Garacci. It seems overseas observers are far more optimistic than a skeptical audience in China, and most of the Chinese observers seem to be very cautious about, for example, the issue of unemployment and lack of confidence in managing public expectations. Let me go back to Robert Cab. Political institutions aside, Robert, Europe and China will be very much alike in the area of, for example, having a huge aging population. Do you view the aging population more as an opportunity or a huge challenge, a drag on the Chinese economic growth?
Well, it's really both. So, yes, it's absolutely a challenge in that the biggest issue with an aging population is you introduce an element to your base of people that isn't economically productive. So that's the challenge. You have to take care of these aging people. The opportunity, of course, is doing just that, servicing them, providing the new places in terms of physical infrastructure, as well as the soft infrastructure services and the way you operate the facilities and so forth. That's then an engine potentially for growth. So it's how you do the two at the same time. You deal with the challenge of the aging population, but you turn it into a growth opportunity. That would be the ideal way to approach it. The problem is China has not invested a lot in healthcare, and that is one of the major areas that in Premier Li Keqiang's work report he talked about. It's been talked about before, so it's going to be very important that China really start to take action on the area of healthcare. It's not been one of its strong areas previously.
But Robert, forgive me for saying that, ironically, it is the huge success of the box office concerning a Chinese movie that may have reversed the political perception by Premier Li Keqiang on why we should import more drugs from countries like India or other industrial nations. Chen Hong, what do you think of the political vision and will on the Chinese side to import more drugs so that the patients of cancers would stand a better chance?
I think it's a very good thing. It always been in the past.
I suppose you know the movie that I spoke of. It's Dying to Survive.
Right,
a very popular movie.
Yeah. I think it's always because cancer drugs are very, very expensive, and a lot of advanced cancer drugs were in the United States, other places produced over there. And China's pharmaceutical industry, compared with the global stage, unlike internet service, others, are much behind. So clearly, at this particular stage, I think getting a zero tariff on the cancer drugs not only fulfill the needs of the patients, but also actually producing a market for foreign companies, drug companies in China is a very good thing. Healthcare industry in China will be huge. If you look at the internet companies, top 10 companies worldwide, 2 of them are Chinese companies, Tencent, Alibaba, over $100 billion US market cap. If you look at the healthcare company, 0. Largest one, $30 billion US, but globally there are 24 companies over $100 billion US company. But China has a huge population. People are aging, as it's just been said. A lot of new opportunities coming up.
Are you suggesting that our family planning policy is most likely to be changed, fundamentally overhauled, if not thoroughly got rid of?
I hope so. You know, I think some of the people have proposed to change the law, because clearly in China today, the birth rate today is 1.67 compared with worldwide.
In some of the first
it's
cities
much
like
lower.
Shanghai, it's a negative population growth rate.
Exactly. And people, you know, clearly for the ladies, for the women in the age of the pregnancy, they go to work, and the past culture of where the kids are growing up, taking care of the parents, that kind of culture is kind of go away and starting to go into your own life. So a lot of things combining together. Also the past policy of only one child has planted very seriously in people's mind. One child is good enough. Now changing that attitude is pretty difficult. So
look at the skeptical fifth eye that David places on your response, okay? I'm not talking about the Five Eye Alliance of New Zealand, but what can we learn from Japan and neighboring countries in terms of coping with aging society? People were talking about, for example, the use of robots or liberation of women from kitchens, so on and so forth. But with the drastic decrease in the divorce rate and marriage in neighboring countries of Japan, it seems Prime Minister Shinzo Abe may have been left disoriented as to how to learn from Germany and other aging societies like Russia in Europe to really look at the embarrassing challenge. So what can we learn from Japan, Germany, Russia? Russia may not be a very good example, by the way, because it's very much an issue of vodka in the winter.
Right. But I think one of the things that China could look at is the disincentives, rather than focus too much on incentives. Disincentives being it's expensive to have children in cities. It's expensive to educate them. And that is a main focus for so many Chinese families, as we know. So making it affordable to have more than one child, I think to remove the policy completely would be a very good idea. Because right now the two-child policy is not delivering the dividends that the government hoped for. So it's about removing the disincentives economically. That's the one thing I also think once one is conditioned that one child is enough, or two children are more difficult than one child, then that's something also to be considered, but really it is an economic question. And with urbanization being such an important aspect of Chinese growth, farmers coming to the city are going to join that thinking where it's too expensive to have more than one child. But ultimately, this is not a demographic crisis that many people have reported on. The aging population of China don't fall on the state, don't fall on the taxpayer, they fall on the family. So the state's not going to be carrying an aging population as it's going to be carrying the aging populations of Japan or those in Europe. So it's not the crisis that people talk about.
We're talking about labor force, of course. Let me go back to Robert. Hi, Robert. This year, an additional increase of up to 11 million job seekers will be placed in the job market. That's a huge challenge for Premier Li Keqiang and indeed President Xi Jinping. What will be done to create jobs so that the massive layoffs will not lead to social instability? I mean, that's indeed a top concern for the Chinese policymakers.
Well, I think one of the more encouraging parts of the work report that's come out is the discussion of increasing loans to small and medium-sized enterprises. They've been traditionally ignored by the state-owned banks, and so the emphasis on that, the reduction on corporate taxes, value-added tax and so forth, hopefully that will provide more stimulus to the private sector. That's really where you'd want to see growth to accommodate the new job seekers. It tends to be the small and medium-sized enterprises of any economy that are the most vibrant part. The large corporations are of course important and they get the headlines, but it's predominantly small companies that provide the most job opportunities.
Robert, what do you think of the prospects of having China as a default economy? Because with the massive release of liquidity into the monetary market, and particularly the RRR, required reserve ratio, and are you going to see a rebound in fixed assets, investment in fixed assets? What does that mean? particularly if you take this issue in the context of, say, the proactive fiscal policy and monetary policy?
Well, it's definitely something that outside observers, as well as I'm sure mindful watchers inside China, are going to be paying close attention to. When you decrease the RRR, the reserve ratio requirement, as well as find other means to pump more money into the economy, that's good in the sense of providing stimulus, but it can be very dangerous in that you're increasing leverage. And China has also set in the 2 sessions now a target of 2.8% debt to GDP ratio over 2.6% previously. The biggest issue with China's debt to GDP ratio is that it's in between a mature and emerging economy. It's not either fully either. And that increase in debt to GDP is troubling. So is the special purpose bonds that are now being allowed for local governments. It's just adding more debt to an already highly leveraged economy.
Hong, what do you think of the dangers of pumping so much money into the market? Will that lead to inflation, or what would be the consequences?
I think they create the inflation, but also I think sometimes may create an asset bubble. So the government, I think, today is really saying the issues we're facing in the last year. There was a joke. People said 2018 was the worst of the last 10 years, but 2019
will be
is
the
best of the next 10 years. Means that some certain companies, pretty huge companies in China, multi-billion-dollar companies, were getting this type of debt issues, bankruptcy, liquidation, etc. So government is really starting putting money into the real economy, trying to stimulate. I think the 2019, even in the government report by the Premier Li Keqiang, the most frequently used words is stabilizing, 稳定. The second one was risk, 风险. So really we believe that in 2019, the government will going to put a lot of effort to injecting a lot of cash liquidity into the market, stabilizing the market, making sure that we have a 6% GDP growth, job requirements being fulfilled, and in the meantime, not getting into the risk of a financial crisis. So that's something where we see in 2019.
But the risks, I think, are considerable. I'm concerned that this statement will mean that there'll be too much easing. China just spent a couple of years really correcting the issues of debt, particularly in the banks. I don't think the spectre of unemployment is as high as people say. And in a way, the government can't manage the market ultimately. The announcement of 6.6 to 6.5 is interesting because it relinquishes something that was very common in the past, which was a target. And everyone went for the target. That's just quite a band, which is a beginning to allow the market to find its own position in terms of what is a natural GDP, a level of growth. So I hope that they don't try and engineer it too much and allow the market, allow the enterprises to actually make their own way. Sometimes a lot of this money is wasted, and so I think that that is the one concerning aspect of the report. But at the same time, it's quite radical. I mean, they've cut VAT, what is it, by 3%.
3%, yeah.
That's a considerable amount, actually. Tax alleviation to companies, those are issues. But I think some of the biggest issues China faces are external. I think Martin's correct, but ultimately it's how you react to external pressure from the United States, the containment of China, the pressure on Huawei. These are the things that China needs to think about carefully.
Looking to the future, Hong and David, Robert, I'm afraid the major issue will be confidence crisis. That might be an exaggeration of, or about the lack of confidence in terms of both investors and the consumers. So when Premier Li Keqiang talked about, say, the reduction of tax and fees, what did he mean?
Yeah, I think what taxes that China has a lot of tax corporation. One in the past complained quite a bit, but very, very high tax ratios being charged upon them. And I think that one of them is the VAT tax, 3%, actually create a lot of savings for the corporation. They can use the money to make investment into the R&D and others. Another thing is that also Social Security taxes are very, very heavy. It's a huge burden for SMEs, because in the manufacturing industry, a lot of small SMEs, they have very, very low margin. Having a very forceful Social Security numbers over there in the taxes make company not survivable. So some of them closed down, etc. So this year, the government is starting putting a limit on those, hoping that SMEs can have a better life moving forward. their business grow, etc. So that's something I think with the government. Li Keqiang said another thing I remember very clearly is that all the intentions are good, policy of reduction of taxes, but how do you implement? That's the issue. Maybe in the smaller towns, other places, local government may take a different approach, maybe accessing additional other taxes, fees. So that what Li Keqiang said, no, from absolute number point of view, the taxes has to be reduced, the fees has to be reduced. I think that's where reflecting the point I just mentioned, stabilizing the economy, and so that company can grow.
In fact, the President Xi Jinping came up with the 6 factors of destabilization, or the other way around. First of all, unemployment, financial risks, foreign trade and investment. The last but not the least is, of course, public confidence. So, Robert, what do you think of the severity of labor shortage? On the one hand, we have the negative population growth in first-tier cities like Shanghai, despite relaxation of a family planning policy. On the other hand, given the costs, the rising labor costs as well as costs of raw materials, particularly concerning real economy, do you think these will compound the dangers we face, the multiple challenges?
Well, certainly as China's economy matures, its cost base increases. That's everything from labor, like you were talking about, to just the cost of operations. Everything just costs more to factor in to the economy. So this will push China to do more things along the lines of automation. It's been investing quite a lot in there. And then with the declining labor force, with this aging population situation, it's going to be a further incentive beyond just the cost base to do that. So it's all a matter, just as the previous commentator was mentioning, how do you implement? You know, these can all be opportunities if implemented effectively.
Robert, you know, eye alluring concerning the process of legislation in this year's 2 sessions, it would be, of course, the approval, if possible, by the lawmakers of the foreign investment law. The foreign investment law is said by experts here in Beijing to be something that the Chinese government would rush into legislation to live up to the expectations of Americans by the time the 2 heads of state meet, possibly in Mar-a-Lago, to apply finishing touches to the marathon-like trade agreement. What do you think of the bulk and the most important part of the 5-point foreign investment law?
Well, the foreign investment law, as I've seen it stated and hopefully will be passed, really is trying to do a lot to provide an equal playing field. It's as if China is finally coming to terms with its original obligations under the WTO based on what foreign observers have been critiquing about it. So it's refreshing. It indeed, just as you mentioned, it really seems to answer the concerns that have been voiced repeatedly by the United States and have now come to a head under the trade war. So if this does get implemented in law, then that could be the final piece of the puzzle to allow the resolution of trade tensions for now. Then the other thing the U.S. has been asking for is monitoring mechanisms. So then it will be a matter of rolling it out. But on the surface, it looks like it really does aim to provide a more equal playing field and also reduce things like bureaucracy. And I understand a total of 3 laws previously applied to foreign investment will now be reduced to just 1.
Thank you so much, Robert. Yes, indeed, we have a lot of discussions and debates about the prospects of reaching a landmark trade agreement between the 2 biggest economies. But the issue, by the end of the day, will be whether President Trump will walk away again, like what happened in Hanoi between the DPRK and the United States. Whether his Chinese counterpart will do the same, I don't know. But see you next time. The same time on Voices of the Vote, our special edition of Dialogue. Until then, goodbye.